There were no haunted animatronics. There never was a Bite of 87.
Was that the Bite of 87?
No crying child, no ghost children chasing William Afton through the pizzeria at midnight, no golden Freddy. Guys, I think it's time. It's time to reboot FNAF. Just a day ago, Game Theory released the Steve Theory, the latest in MatPat's ongoing battle with the FNAF lore. The video has proven controversial, for like the Dream Theory before it, Steve Theory threatens to toss out much of the FNAF lore that we've come to know and rely on. It invalidates countless fan theories, and in a sense, it undoes years worth of perceived work puzzling out the FNAF story. To give a brief summary, in 2019's Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted, it's established that the classic FNAF games we played exist as video games in the FNAF universe.
Okay.
We know that Fazbear Entertainment has developed something of a bad reputation over the last few decades.
Why?
And while it's true that some stories associated with our name were loosely based on actual events, the majority of them were total fabrications from the mind of a complete lunatic. Lawsuits pending.
Allegedly, the Fazbear franchise has fallen into disarray, and people began to spread rumors and urban legends surrounding the pizzerias. Capitalizing on this notoriety, a rogue indie developer named Steve created the classic FNAF games we know, though it's later revealed that for convoluted reasons, Steve had actually been hired by Fazbear Entertainment to do so.
They lied to all of us. They told us that the whole point of this VR game was to undo the bad PR done by a rogue indie game developer, but that's not true at all. Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer.
To be clear, this means that, say, the phone guy recordings from FNAF 1 or 2 aren't recordings of a Fazbear Entertainment employee, it's a voice actor delivering lines for an indie horror game. The iconic news articles that display at the start of each game, those weren't actual headlines that ran in real papers in-universe, it's just an asset made by Steve for their video game. These games we played are the games that Steve made. They're no longer literal representations for what occurred in FNAF's canon, and they could even be total nonsense.
Was that the Bite of 87?
The latest episode of Game Theory focuses on a recent Tales from the Pizzaplex short story titled Help Wanted that sheds more light on the circumstances surrounding Steve, as well as the development of what we know as the classic FNAF games. In particular, Steve is shown to be an especially unreliable narrator, and that's ignoring the fact that he's been commissioned to make these games for nefarious purposes. As MatPat points out, this plot point has some massive implications on the franchise, and the fact that it's once again being emphasized in another modern-era FNAF story suggests that Scott intends to stick with this one. What this means is that any future plot inconsistency can be explained away with, oh, that's because the classic games weren't accurate to what actually happened. They weren't literal representations. For example, if necessary, a future FNAF game could try and say that the crying child didn't actually get chomped by Fredbear at the end of FNAF 4.
Was that the Bite of 87?
That the whole scene was just invented by Steve. They could do that for anything. Some of you might be thinking that this sounds very familiar, and you'd be right. Steve Theory is very similar to Dream Theory, which stipulated that FNAF 1, 2, 3, and the majority of 4 all took place within the confines of the crying child's nightmares. Naturally, this theory was highly controversial. Dream theories are OP by nature, since you can write off any inconsistency by saying, oh, it was just a dream. And plus, it's just lame to think that these games we spent so much time solving had just been dreams. It felt like a cop-out, and the community wasn't happy. In response to the backlash, Scott abandoned Dream Theory, releasing sister location Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator and Ultimate Custom Night. In a surprising turn of events, these games did manage to pull the series together with a satisfying ending, though things had to get a little crazy in order to get there.
So don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
Was that the Bite of 87?
No longer able to rely on the easy out of it was all just a dream, Scott now needed to come up with plausible explanations for some pretty bizarre events. Over time, FNAF ended up integrating more and more science fiction elements, which also proved controversial amongst fans who preferred the series' horror roots. Regardless, Scott gave us an awesome, badass conclusion with FNAF 6, and UCN didn't trivialize that ending in any way. If anything, it reinforced it. The man had done it. Scott had successfully concluded FNAF's story. The next game, Help Wanted, represented a new beginning for Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yes! I've never wanted anything more in my life! Shit, my ball.
It was the first 3D game, it was VR, and it was the first major entry to be made by a developer other than Scott Cawthon. It seemed like the perfect time to reboot the franchise and start a new Five Nights at Freddy's story. Unfortunately, a true reboot was just incompatible with Help Wanted's gameplay. The premise was that they'd remake all the classic FNAF games in VR, and it's kind of hard to reboot a series when the game revolves around adapting the scenarios, characters, and gameplay from earlier entries. They needed a way for the old games to have existed, yet at the same time avoid being constrained by the mountains of associated lore. Thus, they came up with what we now know as Steve Theory, where the old FNAF games did exist in-universe, but as games made by a rogue indie developer based on urban legends surrounding the now ambiguous events surrounding the pizzeria, but actually Fazbear Entertainment hired Steve to make the games because, effectively, this is indeed no different from Dream Theory. While one could argue that Steve Theory isn't as much of a cop-out as it was all just a dream, it's just as OP. Instead of blaming inconsistencies on the earlier games having been dreams, they can now blame it on them being indie games made by an unreliable narrator that aren't meant to be taken literally. Is that really any more satisfying though? Dream Theory was a cop-out, but there was at least a simplicity to it. Now we have this convoluted story about a guy named Steve, all to achieve the same goal, hand-waving away the old lore whenever it's inconvenient to the new games. The problem is that in their efforts to retain the classic game's significance, all they've actually done is cheapen them. Are you really satisfied in relegating Scott's legendary FNAF games to being literal video games? Is trivializing the lore of the classic games really worth being able to awkwardly tie them into newer ones? Is that really any better than just rebooting FNAF? Hear me out. Imagine they just came out and said, the classic FNAF games Scott made are one story, and these new games are a different story that will share some common themes and elements. Wouldn't that show more respect for the series lore, putting a bow on it and saying it's complete? I think they need to leave the old games as they are. They're great, they're fine. We don't need convoluted explanations for how all these events still took place in the recent games. Just start fresh and tell whatever story you want to.
He chooses the illusion, giving his robot wife a hug, who then stabs him to death.
Was that the bite of 87?
We'll all still be interested in FNAF, even if it starts telling a new story that doesn't tie back to years worth of dense lore. If anything, it makes the series more accessible to new fans who currently have to go through hours and hours of game theory episodes to get caught up to the games. Scott and Steele will know that, and I think it's why Security Breach's story ended up being so lackluster. They wanted to appease longtime fans while at the same time releasing a game that newer fans could comprehend. I get the sense that FNAF is obsessed with trying to create this singular canon where all the games equally and meaningfully contribute to some greater ongoing story, but I just don't see that ever happening. Look where we are as a result. We have Steve Theory. Help Wanted does actually sound like a unique story, but to be perfectly honest, I don't think most of us got interested in FNAF to hear stories like this. There aren't any spooky animatronics or dark pizzerias in it or anything. It just seems like a weird direction to go in, all to justify why the new lore might not align perfectly with the old, when it'd be so easy to just say, nope, this is a new story, those games are the old story. It's weird because Scott is clearly okay with doing alternate timelines. We've already seen it with the original FNAF books, and the upcoming FNAF movie is set to be a completely new story, totally segregated from the games, and it's not a big deal. With this in mind, I don't really understand why the series has gone so far out of its way to try and keep all the games in a single continuity. It's like they're just dragging these old games behind them and it's slowing the series down. It's just prolonging the inevitable, a reboot. For some reason, it appears that Scott is very hesitant to do a fresh reboot of the FNAF games. Perhaps he's afraid us longtime fans just won't be interested anymore. Maybe he's afraid that a reboot could throw a wrench in the game theory earned media free marketing machine. Who knows? Either way, I don't think Steve Theory is the best way to handle this. It's just Dream Theory all over again, but instead of a cheap all a dream explanation, we have a convoluted set of events that don't really contribute anything to the story other than to bridge the old and new games in this nebulous way that isn't even satisfying to begin with. I fully agree that the FNAF lore has gotten too dense and complex to tell any actual stories anymore. To quote Scott, "The truth is, after a while, lore can become so dense that there isn't room for a story anymore. Another truth is that what makes for a good game doesn't necessarily make for a good book. Sometimes the timeline gets so full that the only way to tell a real story is to have the story set in a different timeline, an alternate universe, a different location, or perhaps from a vantage point that isn't entirely what it appears to be." I think Security Breach suffered from its attempts to straddle both old and new lore, a case of trying to please everyone but ultimately pleasing no one. Instead, I think they need to recognize that the original FNAF games are already a complete, satisfying story, and they're free to start something totally new without any of these constraints. They can reuse characters, concepts, designs, all of that. Just come out and say, yes, this is done. That may be Burn Trap, but it's a different Burn Trap from a different William Afton who may not have gone through all the same stuff that he did in the classic games. That's fine. Franchises do that all the time. I think everyone would be cool with that. You don't need to justify it by saying the old William Afton existed in a dream or that the exploits of Purple Guy were actually just an exaggerated, fictionalized account by some dude named Steve. It's just not necessary. It's all just bending over backward to avoid having to say this is a reboot, and it kind of cheapens the series. If anything, I feel like just letting the classic games stand and starting something new shows far more respect to the original lore than these cheap, convoluted tie-ins do. How do you feel about Steve Theory? I don't like it, but I do think MatPat is correct in that the franchise is obviously pushing the idea that the older games should no longer be taken literally. Do you agree with me that they should just reboot FNAF, or are you okay with them trying to tie the old lore into the new, even if it results in some dumb, convoluted stuff like this? Let me know in the comments below. Most importantly, however you feel, don't get mad at MatPat. He didn't write the book, and he's not to blame for Steve. He said it himself, he doesn't even like the theory. If you're interested in the details of MatPat's dream theory and how Scott ended up going back on it, check out this video I made a few weeks back. While you're at it, check out my retrospective on Baddington's FNAF VHS series. People really seem to be enjoying it, and I'm really proud of it.
Was that the bite of 87?
Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Remember to Steve that subscribe button, I guess, and then the like button. Just press the goddamn button.